Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Efi Morty with ASTHO, and I'm the Director of Maternal and Infant Health Improvement. And we are very excited to be hosting our second Breastfeeding Learning Community webinar today. And so what I'll do is start off by introducing the rest of the team. So who we have here at the office is Ellen Pliska, Senior Director of Family and Child Health, Gabby Garcia, Director of Maternal and Child Health, and Ashley Plaster, Analyst, Maternal and Child Health. And you'll find their bios that can be accessed in the chat box. All right, so we'll be kicking off the session to provide an overview of the funding opportunity to advance state-level breastfeeding initiatives and health equity. And this will be followed by a presentation from our speakers, Lynn Fick-Cooper and Andy Williams, from the Center for Creative Leadership, who will provide an overview of the boundary-spanning leadership framework and toolkit. There will then be an exercise on the Visioning Boundary-Spanning Leadership tool for states to begin strategizing and thinking about ways to look at breastfeeding initiatives through a health equity lens. After that, we'll open it up to Q&A. All right, so some outcomes or desired outcomes from today's ASTHOConnects would be to provide an overview of the upcoming funding opportunity that is aimed to advance state-level breastfeeding initiatives and health equity. And that will be followed by an overview of boundary-spanning leadership framework and toolkit. And then there would be the exercise conducted using the visioning tool and for states to begin strategizing ways to look at breastfeeding initiatives through health equity lens. So before we begin to dive into our presentation from speakers, we would like to announce that with support from CDC's Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity, also known as DNPAO, we will be offering a funding opportunity to support up to 9 current SPAN states, and so members of our ASTHO Learning Community Cohort 2. And this would be, again, aimed to implement innovations that would advance state-level breastfeeding initiatives and address health breastfeeding disparities. So many of you had the opportunity to attend the convening back in July. And so that was held in Asheville, North Carolina, where Lynn from CCL shared the boundary spanning techniques to work with partners across different sectors on day 1. And then on day 2, there was a focus on equity. And so those 2 themes would be a vital central part of the work that we'll be doing as part of the learning community with the attention on cross-sectoral partnerships, whether traditional or non-traditional, and health equity as well. And so those are important components of the Innovation Award. And so we'll be encouraging selected states to work with partners, specifically with REACH for those who have REACH counterparts in their states or other local community partners. And so we do anticipate that the release of the RFP would be in a week's time, so Wednesday, November 20th. And with that, proposals would be due December 16th. And so additional information would be found in the RFP once released. And that would, as I said, would be come in shortly. So in the meantime, we do have a new resource, the ASTHO Summary of Innovations that took place back in 2018 when we had the benefit of funding 7 states to conduct innovations and address or reach populations that they hadn't otherwise reached. And so that summary is available on our website, and we'll also share with you a link through the chat box as well. And so with that, I'll turn it over to our partners, to the speakers, Lynn Fick-Cooper, Managing Director for Societal Advancement at CCL, and Andy Williams, Director of Population Health for Societal Advancement for CCL. And so their bios also can be found in the chat box, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Efi. Good afternoon or good morning to those of you on the call. Delighted to be virtually in your presence this afternoon to talk about boundary spanning leadership. So many of you I know were at the July convening, and therefore hopefully you remember you were steeped all day in boundary spanning leadership, and hopefully some of those concepts stuck with you or you've been using them since. For those of you who were not able to be with us in July, there are resources I'll show you in a few moments on the toolkit that you've all gotten access to that will help you catch up to better understand. So I'm going to briefly cover what boundary spanning leadership is, because we have a limited amount of time today, just to refresh everyone's memory. And then we'll talk a little bit about the toolkit itself. We'll cover, I'll do a quick demo on where to find some things in the toolkit that you've got access to, and then we'll hone in on one particular tool that we think you'll find useful, especially if you are planning to apply for one of these innovation grants. So to remind everybody, the way CCL thinks about leadership is an important foundational element before we even talk about boundary spanning leadership. So as you might recall from July, you saw this slide then, we really think about leadership. It's a process that might be facilitated by someone who wears a leader title of some kind, but really regardless of your positional authority, you are all engaged in the leadership process when you're doing group work of any kind within an organization or within a community. And that process, that leadership process, when it's done well, it creates three pretty critical outcomes. And those three outcomes are direction, alignment, and commitment. Next slide, please. Direction, just to remind you all, when we talk about direction, we're talking about agreement, and I'm going to underscore that word, agreement in the group on the overall goals. Agreement is important because it's not enough for just, say, the positional leader to put out what the direction is, put out a great strategy or a set of goals or objectives. That's great. Sometimes that's the way direction gets established, but it's not enough for people to just read it or hear it. They have to have time to process it, to ask questions about it, to check out how it relates to their work. All of that is in service of getting agreement, or what you often hear people describe as buy-in on the direction, because until people really can understand and own the direction for themselves and the role they might play in helping achieve it, it's not likely to get achieved. Alignment is the coordination of the work within the group. So this is the often messy work of who's doing what, when, how are we bringing each different person, or if it's a task force or a coalition, each different maybe entity or organization's resources or assets or talents to bear on the particular set of goals we're trying to accomplish. And then finally, commitment. And this outcome, we are talking about mutual responsibility for the group. This is not about commitment to the direction, right? Because as I described, when we're getting agreement on what our goals are, what we're trying to achieve, that's where you get buy-in to the direction or commitment to the direction. Here, we're talking about commitment to the group itself. So when necessary, will you give the discretionary effort required to make sure the group is successful, not just yourself? If that's necessary, if those things might be out of alignment at any particular time, something you wanted to do is different than what the group needs from you at that particular moment to be successful. Commitment to the group would suggest you would actually put the group's goals ahead of your own if that's necessary. So that's what we mean by commitment. And this is a dynamic process that the leader, person in the leader title, might facilitate and needs to pay attention to, but the whole group is really responsible for the production of these three outcomes. Next slide. So when we're talking about boundary spanning leadership, we're talking about creating direction, alignment, and commitment across boundaries in service of a shared mission or goal, a higher order vision, if you will. And so this is when it gets even harder. It's hard enough to create direction, alignment, commitment among an intact work team of some kind. But often, and you guys know this because you do this work in community all the time, you are working across multiple kinds of agencies, different sectors even, different stakeholder groups that don't know how to work together perhaps, never have worked together, don't maybe speak the same language or have the same expertise or information that you do. And so you're trying to create direction, alignment, commitment now across multiple kinds of groups to get everybody working toward the same goal or objective, contributing or aligning their part of the work so that they're all contributing to getting it done, and then seeking that ongoing discretionary effort to make the whole of the group, whatever that is, might be at a very big level in the community, successful. So there's a set of specific practices that we use, strategies and practices that we know from our research work when trying to get direction, alignment, commitment across multiple kinds of boundaries or different groups. Next slide.
So these are those 6 boundary spanning practices that I just referenced. They're categorized by 3 different strategies. The first is you have to understand what the boundaries are between you before you can span them. So it's all about managing and getting clear about what the boundaries are. And the first practice within that we call buffering. And if you'll go ahead and click the next slide, click the button, it's a build on this slide. Hopefully that'll translate. So if you're going to next slide, it should put the build in place. Yep. So buffering is what we mean by really getting clear on what the boundaries are, what is different between one group or another, or one person or another in the group that's working together. How do I identify the sort of unique value that that person or that entity brings to the work we're trying to do? And that whole process, there's lots of things you can do to buffer, but the outcome of that particular practice is it creates safety within the group, and that's a critical foundational element to getting these people who are quite different from one another to feel like they can actually dig in and work together. The next practice is reflecting. Go ahead and click again. It should build to the next. Yep, thank you. Reflecting is really then sharing that information. So once you've done the work to get clear on what the different value and needs of each different stakeholder are in the process, then sharing that information with each other somehow allows you to reflect it back to other people, and thus that creates the outcome of respect. So people at least understand, oh, that's why this group feels the way they do or approaches the work the way they do or whatever it is that makes them unique. You can see it and respect it, know it, understand it, and therefore feel not only safety but respect for those differences. Then we move to the second strategy where we come together, forging common ground. So in the first strategy, managing boundaries, we're just trying to understand each other and how we're different. In the second set, we're really trying to figure out, well, how do we work together now differently than maybe we have before? So the first practice here is connecting. If you hit the slide, next slide button, yep. The outcome of connecting is it creates trust. This is when we're talking about starting to build relationships with the other stakeholders that are not just superficial or surface level around the work that we might be trying to accomplish, just task focused, but really understanding who we are as people, why we show up to do this work, what about it has us passionate, maybe cultural differences between us that we need to deeply understand and learn from each other so that we have a deeper understanding of who we are as human beings, not just the work or the roles we have in this particular task. And that's when you'll start to get trust, when you understand each other more deeply as humans. You don't have to be best friends, but you need to really develop relationships with people to make difficult collaborative work possible. Next slide, please. This final outcome in the Forging Common Ground space is around creating a sense of community, and we call it mobilizing, and that's the act of really bringing people together. Sometimes this is done by creating slogans or taglines or even campaigns around who you are as a group and what you're trying to accomplish, because then you have that sort of unifying sense of identity that creates a sense of community. So for a task force, maybe having a name for that task force, mobilizing everybody to come together and be committed for a period of time to creating health equity around breastfeeding, for instance. Then the final set of practices, the final strategy is discovering new frontiers. Once we've done the other 4, this is where the good stuff happens. This is where we start to get to real interdependent collaborative work and innovation that maybe wouldn't have happened if we had not spanned these differences that exist between us. The first practice here is weaving. If you'll go ahead and click the next slide. The outcome of weaving is, in fact, it creates interdependence. This is where you're really leveraging the different expertise or lived experience or cultural elements of different people's worlds in order to get to a newer, more collaborative, more innovative solution. The outcome of all of this, if you'll click the next slide, click again for me, we get to the final practice of transforming, and this is reinvention. So this is where we get new ideas we may not have ever thought of before. By leveraging all of the differences involved in the work, all the different stakeholders and their viewpoints and their experiences and their expertise, we can now see the world differently. We can start to leverage all of that and come up with a whole new way perhaps of working or of accomplishing the goal. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So the toolkit, I'm going to now ask the ASTHO folks to stop sharing their screen with the slides, and I'm going to share mine and do a quick demo of the toolkit online that all of you will have had access to. All right, quickly switch over here. All right, hopefully in a moment, I know it takes a moment, if somebody from ASTHO could let me know, you can see it on the screen. Yep, okay. In front of you is the toolkit. Now, I've already logged in. When you get your link, you'll have to put in your email address as your username and then the password. We probably started you off with a temporary one, and you could change it. And so ultimately, you'll have a screen before this one that tells you BSL Toolkit, and then you can hit, start or begin or next, the button in the right-hand corner, and it would take you to this opening screen inside the toolkit. There are a lot of resources in this toolkit, and I don't have time to go through all of them today, but I want to just orient you to what is here at a high level so you'll know where to go after the call. First and foremost, if you need a refresher or need to bring other people on your team or in your work up to speed on what boundary spanning is, there are a lot of tools within this introductory tile that can help remind you what it is. There's all kinds of things you could print out to get people to read. There's some videos you could watch about the different boundaries we're talking about the different challenges that these practices can help you with. There's me, unfortunately, explaining the different tactics associated or practice associated with boundary spanning. All kinds of resources in here for you to help more people either refresh yourself, your own memory, or help other people begin to understand what we're talking about with boundary spanning. And I believe when you got your link, Andy Williams pointed out a particular video you could watch to familiarize yourself, and this is where you would find it, is in this Train the Trainer initial tile right here, Introduction and Train the Trainer Kit. The rest of the toolkit is oriented in these three strategies, right? Managing boundaries, forging common ground, and discovering new frontiers, and by each practice that we just went over. And so you've got different tools. I'll just show you one tile real quick. Different tools. For each one of these you click on, different tool options will pop up for this particular practice. So in the buffering category, there's 3 different ways that we're giving you to buffer. I want to say a couple of things at a macro level that cover any tool in this toolkit. These are not hard and fast rules that you have to use this particular tool. If you can come up with another way that would accomplish the objective of creating safety among the people in the process, meaning they feel like they can show up and bring all of their valuable differences to the table and share those effectively with the other people involved, there are multiple ways to do that that I'm certain go beyond what's here. These are the tools we've used frequently and that could be helpful to you. These are process tools, group process tools. So when you click on any particular tool, you would, I'm going to click on the bound, you would get a PDF over here on the right that you could click on to download that would walk you through how to do it, what we're talking about with that particular tool. So I'm going to move you to a tool we're going to actually play with a little bit today in the mobilizing practice. So once you've done the buffering and reflecting work, some connecting work, building some relationships, and people feel sort of safe and that they can trust that they can participate fully, mobilizing the group to sort of help define, okay, for this particular group, whoever's going to be involved in this particular work, in this case, let's say you are going to apply for an innovation grant that ASTHO is offering with funding from the CDC for advancing breastfeeding and achieving more health equity related to breastfeeding. You're going to need, you may already have a task force or a group of people who work on that in your community. I'm sure you do if you're involved in this learning community. But you're going to need to mobilize the troops, if you will, to think about what is the innovation idea that we'd like to see funded and how would we put that forward in a proposal to ASTHO. And so we're offering you a tool through this toolkit that would help you practice your boundary spanning leadership, which you need in order to work with different stakeholders. And frankly, it aligns beautifully with the work with equity, diversity, inclusion work, which we talked about in July on the second day. And these two work really well together because the whole notion of boundary spanning is that you're trying to work with people who are often quite different from each other. And that difference can look in any number of ways. It really doesn't matter whatever the difference is. This process of working with people this way will help you leverage those differences fully and allow people to fully engage with you in the work. So we're going to hone in on a particular tool today called the visioning tool. I'm going to show this to you before we toggle back to the slides and talk about an example of how you would use it related to this innovation grant opportunity that you have. So you'd click on the mobilizing tile first, and then you see kind of midway down the list, there's this visioning tool. These table of contents that you get when you open up the tile show you the list of tools, kind of what they're intended to be used for, right? The description of them and when you might use it. In this case, at the start of an initiative to reframe an issue to help identify the required support you need. It's a great tool, and ASTHO is asking you to use it as you submit your proposal for this innovation grant. When you click on it, you'll get that description again, and then here's to the right over here, a PDF you could download. Just click on that real quickly. That will give you the description of what we're talking about. And I'm going to stop sharing now and ask ASTHO to go back to the slide so we can talk about the use of this particular tool with an example. Just give us a moment to toggle back and forth. Great. And if you go to the next slide. Great. So here's an example that might resonate with folks on the phone. It might sound similar to what you're experiencing in your state, or I'm sure there are lots of variations on this theme. But let's say in this particular case, a state health department wants to partner with the Breastfeeding Coalition, and maybe that's happening in your state, to identify and support communities that are in critical need of additional breastfeeding support. So perhaps there are some under-resourced communities, some minority communities who aren't leveraging or using breastfeeding as much as you want with their infant children. And so one possibility they could explore is, for instance, maybe it's an idea you have or one you've seen work in other communities, opening and promoting a baby cafe that improves access to peer and professional support for breastfeeding for perhaps some of these minority communities that may not be leveraging or using breastfeeding as much as you'd like to see, African Americans, Latinx communities, or Native American families. There are other stakeholders that you'll need to partner with. For example, maybe the hospital staff where these mothers are giving birth, WIC staff, maybe any number of other local groups that might support some of these communities. And communication with all parties along the way is going to be really critical if you're going to be successful at supporting and reaching out to these different populations. So when we think back to the visioning tool, how we might use that in support of an innovation grant. An innovation grant could help perhaps open the baby cafe, right? It could get you started. It could help you fund maybe campaign-related materials to get the information out. So let's go to the next slide and link this back to the visioning tool itself. Next, let's go to the next one, where it's described. Thanks. So here is that PDF that you could download from the toolkit that'll explain how to use the visioning tool. And in it, we talk about the need to collect information from the people that would be involved in the work. So if you want to reach African American mothers who are not right now breastfeeding, or Native American mothers who are not right now breastfeeding in the communities you serve, you really, to honor both boundary spanning and do that with an equity lens in mind, you really need to work with those populations to determine what would help them become better at or more comfortable with breastfeeding if it's not something they're doing currently. And so how do you do that, right? You can make assumptions about what the challenges are. There's probably research out there. And you can also involve the actual constituents you want to serve. So you see the first step in this visioning tool is to, in fact, collect information from the very people that you want to work with. And in this case, I would say the very people you want to serve. So there may be groups you can work with that serve populations that you're targeting. But I would say even better than that would be to talk to actual mothers who may not be breastfeeding and those who may, right? To really understand what are the barriers and challenges right now. Perhaps you've done all of that already with your coalition and you know, you're clear about what the challenges are and you know what's needed to help address those, and the innovation grant can help just catalyze or fund you getting that started. Great, that's information you can include in this particular tool. If you don't already know that information, then that's where you need to begin. How do you involve those people? Can you remember the need to buffer and create safety? So how might you involve them in a way they feel safe to fully show up and talk to you about why they're not breastfeeding? There can be a lot of embarrassment, or maybe even people feeling like they don't want you to really judge them if it's something they're not doing. And so creating a sense of safety for how they can show up and be honest with you about what the barriers are for them to breastfeed would be really important if you're going directly to those populations. So I'd find allies who work with those populations who can help you understand how to best reach them, how to best communicate with them, to get them to be honest and share information if you don't already have that now. But that's really, do nothing to us without us. You really want to try to not come up with an idea without really grounding yourself in what the population you're trying to serve would say would help them. So that's starting place number one, right? Involve others in the creation of the of the vision? What would they like to see? What kind of support do they need? What's missing right now? Is it information? Is it access to support? To even validate whether your idea of a baby cafe would work for the particular communities you're trying to serve. And if it would work, how you could make it work the best. So this tool will walk you through some steps for how to get the information you need, and then how would you begin to communicate that. So go to the next slide. I think I included page 2, but if not, go back. Go back to, so there's a table in the actual PDF you would download. There's a table on page 2 of that PDF that gives you the elements of a great vision statement. And so ASTHO is asking you to create a vision statement, which is really fundamental when you're talking about getting grant funding to make something new happen, an innovation grant. Having a vision for what that's going to achieve for you, how you would use the money, this process will help you populate your vision, create a real achievable plan. It talks about establishing what the big idea is, be clear, right? Craft clear statements about what you plan to achieve by when. State the challenge. I would obviously include in the challenge what you've discovered from the populations you want to serve, are the barriers that this idea you have might help overcome, and why you think that will work. The values, what's the impact of this kind of work going to have on the populations you want to serve, and thus on society? What's the real long-term, short and long-term ROI, if you will, of this innovation idea? And so on and so forth. And so ASTHO's even put into the proposal, you'll see when it comes out, the opportunity for you to include the population of this table that is part of this PDF as part of your grant proposal. So I did that in record time, good. So we've got plenty of time for questions, because this was a case example that we think is relevant for the kinds of things you might be facing and thinking about doing in your community. But what we really want to hear are literal examples or questions you have as you think about how to improve breastfeeding and create greater equity across your own communities around the use of breastfeeding. How might you use boundary spanning, this particular tool, as part of seeking an innovation grant to make that happen? What questions might you have? And if I need to go back to the toolkit, I can. So I'm going to turn it back over to the ASTHO folks to moderate questions that people have.
Great, thanks, Lynn. That was record time. It leaves us a lot of room for answering any of the participant questions. If you have anything to ask, here's your chance. There is a Zoom webinar chat box on the right hand of your screen. So any questions that you have, please feel free to post them there, and we'll be answering those questions now.
And make sure, as you are posting in the chat box, you can either use the chat box or the designated Q&A area. If you choose the chat box, go ahead and change the designated recipient. It'll say all panelists, and we want you to select all panelists and attendees so everybody can see your discussion.
And if you have questions that are beyond the visioning tool itself about other parts of the toolkit, and there's no bad question. So ask questions of the ASTHO folks about this opportunity, ask questions of me about the boundary spanning toolkit, its use, this particular visioning tool, whatever would help you right now. How you can be ready.
I have a question. This is Ellen from ASTHO. When a state team is using this for the first time, Lynn, how long would you say that this typically takes to fill out, and what kind of considerations might they want from other partners that they may be working with in developing it?
Yeah, I wish I had a clean answer for you, because of course it depends. You do need to start early, right? So if you've got a month for this opportunity to turn this proposal around, you can't wait until the week before it's due to start thinking about involving your stakeholders in crafting your vision, in part because it's hard to get on people's calendars and get time. Again, not knowing where each of you are in the stage of your knowledge about the audiences you're trying to serve. So if you are trying to reach some maybe underserved communities or parts of your community that maybe don't use breastfeeding right now as a mechanism for their children, then how do you get that information? Is it through other stakeholder groups you want to partner with, or are there ways to reach the population directly and kind of get idea sharing, get conversation going with them, whether that's through one-on-one interviewing of individual mothers, whether it's working with folks who serve those people, whether it's getting focus kind of groups together to have conversations in those communities. You need to think that through. What information do you need that you don't already have? If what you have is you can bank on, is sort of real and true for the population you're trying to serve, great, you may have that step covered. And then it's working with your stakeholder groups that need to be in that work with you moving forward to serve whatever your idea is, either to brainstorm the innovative idea if you don't already have one, and or test and validate it, and also just be thinking about how to craft the actual vision statement. You want those parties involved in helping you craft it. The more people have been part of the process of co-creating the idea or the solution, the better off you're going to be at the other end when you're trying to implement it and make it happen. And so there's not a hard and fast sort of amount of time rule, but I would sit early and think about where you are in your process, what information you need to get, who you need to be involved to really reach the audience you want to reach, and where this particular $25,000 influx of resources could help you advance your work most effectively. And then you can go about setting appointments, maybe dividing and conquering the tasks of reaching different people in the community, working with different stakeholders. And then I'd say you probably need a meeting, couple of hours at least, of some key people to help you think through, okay, what do we know? What have we learned? What do we know? What's our big idea for how we could address that and accomplish and help and support those particular families around improving their breastfeeding usage? And then crafting the actual vision is probably not most efficient as a big team exercise. Maybe a few core team members who fill out the table and sort of craft the verbiage, because it's never a great idea to have 30 people wordsmithing something, but you do want all your stakeholders involved in co-creating a big idea and what they think is needed to make it happen, so that you've got that buy-in already built in, and then if you get the grant, you can hit the ground running. So I hope that answered your question, Ellen. I know it wasn't a specific amount of time, but just a caution not to leave it to the sort of, week before it's due to begin that thinking.
I think that's sage advice.
Great. Well, thank you. We do have some questions coming in. We would like to sort of go over the grant dates again for those of you that are asking about the anticipated deadline, and then also about when we will be releasing the actual RFA, and then finally who will be eligible and if it will be available to both SPAN grantees and then also REACH grantees. Evie, do you want to take over that?
Yes. So to quickly go over the key dates to keep in mind, we do anticipate releasing the RFP in a week's time, and so by November 20th is when we anticipate releasing the RFP. We are anticipating a due date from applicants by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on December 16th to submit applications, and we intend to announce winning applicants by December 20th. In terms of eligibility, those that are eligible for the innovation grants are cohort 2, and so this present learning community cohort of SPAN states who are participating in ASTHO's breastfeeding learning community. Now, we are giving states the opportunity to select representatives should they be interested in the opportunity but do not have the capacity that is to apply. They may select an entity to represent them or have an entity apply on their behalf. And so this could be a coalition, this can be a university, it could even extend to REACH grantees as well. Now, as part of the RFP, there is the strong encouragement for states to engage with their REACH counterparts, and that is for the 9, I believe, SPAN states that do have REACH recipients in their jurisdiction. And so they're highly encouraged to collaborate with the REACH recipients or with the local community entity.
Great, thanks, Evie. while we're waiting for questions, Lynn, do you have any advice for perhaps those who have traditionally worked together in the past before and may not have done this type of building, you know, buffering or whatnot, in terms of going back through a process to establish, you know, the trust and the safety that's needed, in terms of having this model and in the application for the potential RFA?
Lynn, you are on mute.
Thank you. I forgot I had muted. I'm talking away. Nobody's hearing me. Thank you. I think there'll be various, obviously, scenarios that will be different for different groups, but it is, I think, so one caution I would give, I think it's tempting when you've worked together for a while and you have an established group to think you probably have all the people involved that you need, and you may. I don't know enough about each of your groups, and you only brought representatives of those groups with you to July, so maybe you do have all of the kinds of stakeholders or different perspectives represented on your existing group, but I would think long and hard as a first step about that. You know, do we have all of the different voices we need to hear from around our work to advance breastfeeding in our state or in our community and from a more equitable lens represented in our group? And if we don't, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to add formal members to your group, but what are the ways you could begin to get those different perspectives? Who's missing, and whose perspective, whose voice, whose experience, whose lived experience is missing from your current group? So I'd challenge that first. And then if you do identify, wow, we are missing some key voices that maybe we think we know, but we want to challenge our assumptions and make sure we know what those particular perspectives or people or identity groups need in the way of breastfeeding, how could we get those? And so whether that is inviting new members or reaching out to different kinds of stakeholders or partners or groups that reach those populations, or finding direct access, that's a starting place. And then the buffering becomes really key. Well, all of the first steps do, but because you need to establish a way for those folks to show up and inform you and co-create with you a potential innovative idea. And so we tend to, because we're steeped in this, right? We know what we think will work. We know the science behind breastfeeding. We know the value of it. We work with all these already existing great stakeholders. And so we may, with all good intentions, invite people to show up to our table, right? We say, oh, look, we have a meeting and we want your perspective, so come join us, right? We'll feed you a bagel, whatever it is, and give you coffee, and come tell us what you think. Well, that can still be really difficult and intimidating for some people who just may not know how to show up in that setting and feel like they can just share their intimate details of whether they do or don't breastfeed with you. So you just need to be very thoughtful about how to create a sense of safety. And there are some tools in the toolkit that can help you with that. Think that through, but also just using your own understanding of, wow, what would I need if I were to show up in a room that was very different from me and people were asking me intimate questions about whether I am comfortable breastfeeding my children or have done that, or what were the barriers getting in my way, or what even helping me understand the value of breastfeeding over another method. What would I need, right, to show up and feel like I could be myself, share honestly, and get the support I need, and or reach out to other allies who could help you with that. But I think those, that's one example of what I would describe. Gabby, I think I also heard in your I think it was Gabby who asked the question. I think the other thing I heard in your question was, if you're an established group, maybe you have all the multiple perspectives, but you need to kind of go back and ensure that you understand each other fully. Maybe bring out some elements you haven't before if you haven't done the buffering step. And so don't shy away, even though you may have worked together for a long time, from going back and doing that. You can probably do it pretty quickly if you've got established relationships, but you will probably unearth some things. I've seen this happen with groups I've worked with where they unearth things they hadn't before. Ask yourself questions that maybe you don't know the answers to. For instance, how money flows is often a taboo subject, right? So if we've got multiple agencies, a hospital, a state health, public health department, or a local public health department, a nonprofit or two involved, they all receive their funding and have different restrictions on how they use it and how it gets budgeted and how resources get allocated. That's all different in all those organizations. And we don't often share what that looks like in reality, and therefore what the limitations are of how we might be able to work together or how we have to structure things. That's just one example, but that's often kind of hidden information that will back up on us later when we're trying to actually now, let's say, take a grant from the CDC or ASTHO and figure out how to leverage it and use it. And we have one fiscal agent that has a way they have to do that that's not serving our needs. If you don't talk some of those details through and unearth some of that information, you'll get tripped up potentially later. So I would think through, wow, what haven't we talked about that might be kind of important information for us to know to kind of get our work together to the next level of collaboration. And there are lots of different ways to do that. The tools here are other ways you could, I'm sure, think of yourself. So keep in mind the outcomes each of those practices creates. Buffering creates safety. Reflecting creates respect. You have to share that information from the buffering stage to respect what people are up against, and then so on and so forth. And if you keep the outcome in mind and focus on how would we get to that outcome most effectively, you'll be well served.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. And there's a couple of different examples, correct, in the toolkit that everybody's receiving to get them to each of these 6 areas.
There's different tool examples? Yes. Do you mean, is that what you mean? Yes, there are. When you pop open that particular practice, you'll see a list of different tools. It'll describe it. It'll give you ways to how it's best used, and then a deeper dive PDF for each one. Some of them have videos to go with them if they're more complex, but all of them come with a PDF that describes how to actually put it into use.
Great, thank you. Another question that we had was, what could you kind of talk about, there's a comprehensive way to use all 6 of the boundary spanning strategies, but perhaps the team may only, look at using 2 or 3. Is there a way to think through the process and sort of combine each of the strategies to work with each other?
Gosh, there's a lot in your question. I think, so one thing is, if you're wondering where to begin, right? So if you've kind of been working together for a while and you think about the 6 practices and you think, oh, we've got safety and respect and trust among us because we've got a lot of different people, but we've worked together and we've uncovered our information and we know each other well, and you say, yep, we've got those outcomes, but you don't know where exactly to begin, or you want to make sure you're not making unnecessary assumptions there. There is an assessment in the toolkit that you can take for your group. It's a boundary spanning assessment that you could have. The way I would use it is to have it's likely in the train the trainer tiles when you click on that tile, and you'd have every different person on your group or your coalition or task force completed independently, and then tally the results across those and see, because it'll tell you, wow, we may have thought maybe we lead this group or we convene the group or facilitate it, and we thought we were done. We were good on buffering and connecting and reflecting, but maybe not everybody in the group feels like they do have enough information about everybody else. So you'll get a sense of where to begin from the assessment, where you're kind of weakest and might need to go back and revisit some of the tools. So if in fact the assessment shows, yep, we're pretty good, we're at the mobilizing stage or we're at the weaving stage, then yeah, I think you can focus and then start there. There's nothing wrong with not starting at the very beginning, because you may be established enough or have done the work organically on your own enough to have accomplished those outcomes without these specific tools. So you can start at any point along the way, and some of the tools can be used to get you a couple of things accomplished at once. So for example, if you find you are at the final set of practices, the weaving and transforming stage, like you've worked together a long time, you've got an established group of different identities, differences who've come together, who've achieved all the outcomes up through mobilizing, and you're at that, but we're trying to get to really interdependent, innovative work. There are a couple of tools in both those sections that you could use to accomplish both weaving and transforming, meaning you can work interdependently to transform to a new idea. And so you could, World Cafe, for instance, is in there. That's a great way to get a lot of different stakeholders to imagine a new way of being. That's all about the questions you pose and people working interdependently to answer those questions or come up with big ideas. So you can definitely tackle more than one at a time, and you can, because typically buffering and reflecting go together, weaving and transforming can go together. It's hard to do all 6 if you need to start at the beginning in one meeting, because that's a lot, and you typically only meet for an hour or 2 as groups. But it's appropriate to start anywhere you need to, and to try to kind of combine if you need to do that for time's sake. Absolutely. And did that answer your question, Gabby?
It does. Thank you so much. Well, we're not seeing any more questions right now in the chat box, but we do have a couple more minutes. So if you have questions, please feel free to send them our way. Should you have any questions, afterward, please feel free to reach out to ASTHO at breastfeeding@astho.org for any follow-up questions that you may have, either on the tool or the upcoming RFA, or any resources that we could provide in terms of answering your questions for the application. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley, and she can go over some of the next steps.
Thank you, Gabby. In terms of next steps, we encourage SPAN recipients participating in ASTHO's breastfeeding learning community to apply for this upcoming funding opportunities. We also encourage SPAN recipients to coordinate with breastfeeding efforts with your fellow REACH participants if they reside in your state. And then we're going to leave it off with Vic for final steps.
And I would like to add that all should keep an eye out for an informational call that would go into the RFP in a little bit more detail. And we anticipate that to be November 22nd. Everyone would receive an email regarding the informational call. And again, this will be an opportunity to learn more about the RFP, and we'll be taking more specific questions about the RFP during that time.
All right. Well, we want to thank everyone for attending today's ASTHOConnects. Please take a moment to complete our evaluation module via the link in the chat box. Your evaluation of this Connects is very important to us, as we are always striving for continuous improvement. If you are unable to complete the module at this time, you will receive the evaluation link via email. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.